Hello, everybody. This is week 7, part 2. Again, week 7, part 2 of the effects of the Cold War in Asia. This lecture will be taking a look at what happened in Southeast Asia, which was by far even bloodier than Korea when you take everything and add it up. I'm being a little bit flippant, and I probably shouldn't be. This is, I think, the most tragic period of history that we will discuss in this course. So let's go on to slide 2. The invasion of Southeast Asia by the Japanese during World War II transformed that area just as much as it transformed China. I wouldn't want to say which one was changed more, but there was immense change that resulted. Taking a look back at the period before the Japanese invasion just for a moment, there was, of course, the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, that started with a stock market crash in the U.S. in October of 1929, and spread around the world, causing massive unemployment and shrinkage of capital, and therefore deflation, as there was suddenly less money on the markets in a way that is somewhat similar to what happened a few years ago in this time, where, in other words, a lot of money that everybody thought they had turned out to be non-existent. Debts were called in that couldn't be paid off, and the value of different sorts of property, particularly shares in companies, but also other forms of economic activity, suddenly dropped. And so where there was a lot of money before, there was somewhat less, and that caused markets to shrink because people didn't have the funds to spend on manufactured goods anymore, which meant there was less manufacturing, which reached out to Southeast Asia just as it reached out everywhere in the world, causing prices to fall, rubber prices to fall, tin prices to fall, the price of natural resources of other sorts, not so much oil, but products from countries that grew agricultural things for their exporting livelihood. So the prices of coconut-related products went down, for example, and other forms of vegetable oil. Anyway, I'm getting too far into that. The point is that when the economies turned bad in Southeast Asia, in countries that were colonized, the home governments did not do their best to try to alleviate suffering in the colonies because they were more worried about the homeland. And so that was the first disappointment in Southeast Asia of people in power that was held by ordinary people. The next disappointment came when the Japanese attacked and the colonial powers found that they could not defend their colonies in Asia, and so they wrote them off. Churchill, for example, was happy to ask the Australians to send a lot of troops to Singapore and Malaya, and he sent some British forces there as well, but he decided early on that Singapore was hopeless. And of course, Britain was under attack by the Nazis. Therefore, priorities had to be drawn. And British colonies in Asia were not given a priority. The next disappointment came at the hands of the Japanese, whom some people, as we've discussed previously, thought were going to be liberators, but they weren't. Actually, they were quite the opposite. And so the difficult wartime conditions suffered by people in Asia under the Japanese were the third strike, you might say. So when the colonists came back after the victory over Japan, they were no longer thought of as being in any way invincible. They had screwed up during the Great Depression. They had screwed up in World War II. The Japanese had come in, another kind of colonist, and had been extremely abusive. And so this led, going on to slide 3, to people making choices. Not everybody made the same choice. The most popular choice was to stay uninvolved, of course. Always the wisest choice when you are a powerless farmer who is regularly abused by people holding power in your local district, and all of a sudden the world is changing and you wonder what you should do. The wisest course of action is to lay low and hope you don't get noticed. However, not everybody was like that. Some people wanted to make a choice to choose a side. And here I've tried to, in a very rough fashion, give you some choices. Should I cooperate with the colonists, whether they're the Americans, the French, the British, or the Dutch, and help them reestablish the old regime that worked so well for me? Well, if that's not a good choice, maybe I should join an organization that was previously dedicated to their overthrow, which, of course, landed their own members in jail and caused them to be tortured and their families to be killed in the night. That might be a good choice for some people. Or maybe I could join a new group that promises to take a different road, or maybe I could become a Marxist. Many people made each of these choices. Plus, like I said, the most popular one to just keep my wee ass out of the way. Going on to slide, are these numbered? I'll make sure they're numbered. Going on to slide 4, where it says decolonization in phases. So you can see a color coding on this map that shows us that the British and the Americans were the first to withdraw from their rather difficult occupations in India, Burma, and the Philippines. And the Philippines was a slightly different case than India, certainly. There was no Mahatma Gandhi leading a nationalist movement and trying to shame the Americans from staying in the Philippines. However, the Americans had decided for their own reasons that there was no compelling reason to stay in the Philippines. Besides, they could withdraw and get everything they wanted anyway, which was to retain favorable trade relations and access to military bases. So they withdrew. The British withdrew for reasons you're probably familiar with from India, which is not actually part of this course, but has to be mentioned. And they also withdrew from Burma. There was no reason compelling them to stay there at all. And the French were the next, and the Dutch were the next in this phase 2 here. In phase 3, you see on this map, to leave their more lucrative colonies. They were prompted to try to stay because their colonies were lucrative, but they had to leave in the end. And I didn't list the British here, but the British withdrew in this second phase, actually third phase, from Malaysia. And then we look at Indonesia leaving East Timor as the Portuguese depart due to the Carnation Revolution, as it was called in Lisbon, when young army officers decided they'd had enough of dying in Africa, for the most part. And Australia granted independence to Papua New Guinea. So that was sort of like the last hurrah, sort of a whimper of colonialism. The real decolonization, of course, happened between the end of World War II and 1963. So let's go on to the next slide. Soviet objectives in Asia. What were the Soviets up to all this time? Well, I like this cartoon because it's funny. You see a British-looking man wearing a safari hat, smoking a pipe. He's got golf clubs, and he's being bid a fond farewell by people who look like they're from Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, India, and perhaps Malaya. And sneaking in the back door are fat Russians. I love the imagery. There's some truth to this. I would say this is not what actually happened, of course. It would be silly to think that everyone who bade farewell to the British did so with a smile on their face and love in their heart. And it would also be silly to think that the Soviets were successful. This is what they tried to do, certainly. They tried to, figuratively speaking, to come in through the back door as the colonialists left. But their objectives were to, very simply stated, avoid being encircled by the United States. The United States was pursuing a containment strategy, which they extended to China. The Soviets wanted to not be surrounded by American power. It was rather hard not to be because of the enormous power from which the United States, with which the United States emerged after World War II, particularly on the high seas. But the Soviets managed to pull off a few tricks. They recovered their influence for the most part in Manchuria, for example. They got Kim Il-sung going in Korea. It was Kim's idea, of course, something we talked about in the previous lecture. They wanted to extend their influence south as well. And the reason to do that was to, again, keep the United States busy in parts of the world that were not pressing up directly against the Soviet Union, in order to maintain their own independence and freedom of maneuver. Then came the break with China that we discussed last week, and things changed a little bit. We'll get into more of that in the next few slides. Going on to the next slide, it says the Malayan Emergency, 1948 to 1960. So this would be slide 6. This is an interesting sideshow to the Cold War because it involves a communist revolution that did not work. There's a reason that it did not work. It was very well planned and very well carried out, but the math was simply not on the side of the revolutionaries. In Malaya, you will find a majority of native people, the Malays, and you will find smaller percentages of people from India who were brought there to work for the British when they were colonizing the area, and you will find Chinese, roughly 10% Indian, 15 or 18% Chinese, something like that, in Malaya. And the Chinese came in partly as labor, but partly on their own to do business. So the Communist Party of Malaya was made up mostly of Chinese, a very large percentage, probably 80% of the CPM was ethnic Chinese. They assisted the Allies in World War II with down flyers and with guerrilla actions against the Japanese, and they held a very wide appeal amongst ethnic Chinese in Malaya. After the war, people who were working for the communist guerrillas near Hong Kong were actually evacuated from there by the British and sent to Malaya. The reason for that was that the dominant power in the area in the counties outside of Hong Kong belonging to China after World War II was the Kuomintang, the KMT, the Nationalists, or the GMD. The Nationalists wanted the communist guerrillas out, and they were relatively isolated. And the British had gotten along very well with that force that was in the area, which had rescued down flyers and which had gotten intelligence on the Japanese and had slit a few throats here and there. And so the British were doing them a favor, and by evacuating them down to Malaya, and some of them went on to fight the British. It only took a few years. The economy of the late 1940s was depressed everywhere except in the United States, pretty much, and Canada. There was a recession, really almost a depression going on in Britain, and the rest of Western Europe was destroyed. We spoke about the Marshall Plan earlier, and you've probably had that in some other course you've taken on U.S. or European history. So the same was true in Malaya, and the problems in the economy led to strikes, and eventually Stalin sent word by radio that the CPM, the Communist Party, should resist the British, and they went into the jungle and did that. When they did, they were very effective, but the problem, again, was in the numbers. They were a distinct minority. And the bottom line there was that they simply could not rally enough people on their side. The British tried an interesting strategy. You'll see a video I've attached to the resources, under the resources tab, I think it is, the course content tab. A very short video that describes that situation and shows, there's no sound to it, but it shows it shows one of these new villages that were constructed by the British, surrounded by barbed wire, and loaded up with all the Chinese people in the county. So what the British did was they took all the Chinese people in an area and put them inside a barbed wire village and put guards on the outside. And what's there not to like? There's no contact with the CPM guerrillas amongst the people who would be inclined to support them. The only people left outside the wire are non-Chinese who didn't like the CPM guerrillas, partly because of the difficult ethnic relations between Indians, Malays, and Chinese in that part of the world. And eventually the British were able to deprive the CPM of their support and cause them and force them to retreat. There was a renewed resurgency a decade later, but while it lasted for, what is this, 12, I'm losing my math, 67, 77, 87, over 22 years. So it lasted for 22 years, but it really didn't amount to much. That's the simple way to state it. Now, I spend so much time talking about this one little case because the Americans studied all this very carefully. They concluded that a similar strategy might be used in Vietnam, and they tried it, and it showed some success, but it didn't work, and we'll get more into that in subsequent slides. I'll stop here, and we will continue on slide 7.